Delighted to have the opportunity to be part of this and such a relevant theme around embodied ministering and ministry. And lovely to see some familiar faces. I know some of you won't have met me before, but there are some people here I do know. So it's delighted to be amongst friends, new and older. I'm going to begin just by sharing the screen, because I'm going to talk for probably no more than 20 minutes, introducing some thoughts about embodied ministering, and actually I've given it the additional heading of presence in pandemic. So I wanted to start by thinking a little bit, it may seem to many of us now rather a long time ago, probably prior to February 2020, and a world that now seems rather different in all kinds of ways to the world we're in today. And at Methodist Homes, where, as Sue says, I'm a Director of Chaplaincy and Spirituality, and we operate 90 care homes as well as 70 retirement living schemes. Physical presence in schemes and with people is a really important part of what we do. So this photograph was taken actually 2 years ago. I'm delighted to say the lady is now approaching her 109th birthday. Remarkably, not actually in a care home, but in a retirement living scheme, which has a degree of support. But you can see there she is with her great grandson, and as you might imagine, a very big day of celebration, the kind of thing probably where the mayor would have visited, and lots of family and lots of friends being together. And perhaps we took those moments at times too easily for granted. But presence matters a great deal in the area of work which I'm involved in with ministry with older people, partly because as we get older, I can speak for myself as much as anybody else, it may be our hearing isn't quite as good, our eyesight may not be as fresh as it once was, and therefore being able to be with people physically offers many other cues to support and contact and recognition, which are not found in the same way in non-physically present ways of ministering. It also means when a chaplain, for example, is around in a care home, it can be in the tone of voice, the size and familiarity of our physical presence, perhaps not something we discuss very much, and even the casual encounter rather than a set-up meeting, an opportunity to talk. One of the key phrases in much of the literature about chaplaincy is being there. And I've reflected on that a lot in the last 18 months. So many of the titles, articles are about what matters so much in chaplaincy is a physical presence alongside people, a form of ministry which theologians and practitioners of chaplaincy have referred to in incarnational terms. Being in and amongst a group of people, it's been accepted as crucial to the practice of this ministry. Before 2020, there were some examples of doing things at a distance, and within healthcare, there was already a fledgling body of work and activity around telemedicine, but it was pretty unusual within chaplaincy. It did happen, it happened by phone, perhaps with relatives and so on, but generally, the principal people whom chaplains were ministering to were seen and visited in person. And now we come to something else, not the after, if you like, but the during still. This is a rather remarkable painting, I find. It was painted in March 2020, and perhaps illustrates in a rather unusual way the dramatic speed of change. It's by the artist Robert Powell. It's entitled Plague Year 2, The Annunciation. An artist who represents humanity in all its perplexing intimacy, grandeur and folly. This painting feels like the overlay of works from several eras. An angel Gabriel dressed as a medieval plague doctor, a classical portico, Mary as a woman from a contemporary time. And what interests me in terms of the what I'm saying today is the isolation of Mary. The angel doctor is backed up by a cohort of professional peers, almost touching, safe, distant, and the faces of those who purport to care cannot be seen. and Mary seems to crumple on her pedestal, hearing the news of her condition. In a host of different ways, the painting takes a hugely familiar theme and jolts us to question its meaning. Who is being protected from whom? Where does safety lie? Why is the familiar suddenly concealed? So during COVID, ministry has been impacted, as many I'm sure on this conference today will know, in a host of different ways. During May last year, I began to think that time was passing. And there is always a way that you look at events once they're completed that is rather different than you look at them as you're proceeding through them. So we took the decision in MHA to interview 6 chaplains. And so there were in-depth qualitative interviews with 6 chaplains at the end of May about their experience. And we selected chaplains in particular, some of whom were fully immersed and active ministering in a home, others who, due to medical conditions or linked to age, were not in a home, but supporting at a distance, and some who didn't feel they had any role at all and were sensing a degree of powerlessness about their position and ability to be a minister. After we'd done those, we found that the information was so valuable and provided such an insight into what was taking place that we decided to repeat them quarterly for a year. So we have in fact just come to the end of doing 4 sets of 6 interviews with the same chaplains, some of whose position within the pandemic was changing. So I will read this out because I know not everybody, I think, is able to see the video. Some have joined us by phone. So this is one of the quotes from one of the chaplains in this study. So we talk of ministry of presence and how that translates for people. Just to be seen without conversation adds a lot of value. If you think about our communication, what is it? 7% is our words. Everything else is our tone and our body language. You've seen somebody come out of a wing and they are passing through to go to the other wing. In that passing through, they stop. There is a moment, there is a kind of tear wiping, and you're there and with your eyes because you've got all your PPE on. You're holding them and you are holding that space and you are holding that moment without adding words, and then they go again. And there's something, I think, very powerful, very meaningful that you can't do from a distance. Many chaplains and clergy simply couldn't be with people during the pandemic, and that's the reality. And I think as human nature often spurs us on, and faith does, to make the best of the circumstances in which we find ourselves, there were very many creative expressions of using digital and other forms of remote technology. However, nevertheless, for some, this experience was disempowering and caused anxiety. As I mentioned, there were creativity. We had some chaplains who couldn't be with people and would prepare newsletters and send those into the home. If I can describe it this way, and it may be an area of work you're familiar with or perhaps you don't think about very much, but as I mentioned at the start, we have care homes and we also have retirement living. And care homes, I think probably we all know what those are. Retirement living are flats that are effectively independent. And it struck me not that long ago that it feels in some ways that during the pandemic, MHA was operating isolated communities, because care homes, even when they were closed to visitors, still had staff coming in, perhaps talking about their families, conveying news, being part of a community within the care home. But we also had communities of isolation. And our retirement living complexes, people were often simply behind their front door, apart from a medical appointment or some very pressing need to leave the scheme. And I think that's been a very different experience. So I went not long ago to film 2 residents, and I hadn't appreciated that though they were in the same building, they had not physically seen each other for a year. And that brings home a little bit that sort of, I say, a community of isolated people, as opposed to a community that is itself isolated from the wider community. Of course, Christians have always supported people at a distance. I mean, what is prayer? But keeping people in mind, thinking of them when we cannot be with them. It's been as long as there has been the Christian faith, that has been a part of what we've done. But generally, that at distance support has often been rooted or tethered or connected to a physical encounter, either in pastoral ministry or perhaps earlier in our life, perhaps in another area of ministry, another area of the country or the world. And prayer continues to keep that link alive. So while not ideal, virtual support has sustained people and appears to be most successful where in-person contacts have taken place pre-pandemic. We did have some chaplains who actually took up their role during the pandemic and were not able to visit, for example, if it was a retirement living scheme, and really difficult to make those phone calls and Zoom calls and so on to people they had never met in person. And one quote there from a paper published in the last year, which supports the use of these forms of technology. Our experiences commend the use of virtual video technology for maintaining connection, relationship and belonging, key spiritual domains, against the backdrop of isolation and physical distancing, an example of spiritual closeness and pastoral care in a physically distant world. When I think about the theology of what is going on, and I think it is enduring and informative and something that is quite dynamic at the moment, because we're simply not the other side of this experience to be able to digest it or reflect from a different place. There is a huge amount of sacrifice and loss in that absence of physical contact and presence. We hear it, have heard it from people in our services who haven't been able to see a relative, or as you all know, in an earlier stage of the pandemic, having to do window visits, as we called them, if that was possible, when people couldn't physically come into a place that we were managing due to the restrictions that were around. People really missed family. They missed visitors from the community. It was a particular challenge for us. For example, we've never had a national committee planning Christmas, but in 2020 we did. Because again, as some of you will know very well, Christmas lasts at least 2, if not 3 months in a care home, because it is so rich in things that locate somebody who might otherwise perhaps have some level of confusion about where they are within the year. The visual things are incredibly recognizable, the music. We'd have people coming in, choirs from local churches, school children coming in and perhaps doing a nativity, but all of that. And we suddenly realized, given the way things were going in September last year, that this was very unlikely to happen as we were used to it. And that would be a great loss to many of the people, not only our residents, but our staff within those places. Singing was prohibited. It's very hard to tell somebody who is living with a degree of dementia that they can't sing a Christmas carol. So all kinds of challenges about mental capacity and our embodied being and people's natural responses to sing and to participate. And we did what we could, but even doing what we could, it emphasized to us how much had changed and been lost at Christmas 2020. People were incredibly supportive, and I suppose with this focus on kind of embodied ministry, what has struck me a number of times is the value of combining some token of physical presence with a distance pastoral support. So I've heard chaplains who are also involved in community ministry talking about writing letters to people, which sounds probably very old-fashioned in some ways, but being able to put those through somebody's letterbox, and maybe there's a phone call, and the two things, the physical, the tactile, and what somebody can hear over the phone or see over the computer are connected. Perhaps that small physical token anchors that pastoral encounter. And in the early days of the pandemic, because I couldn't go into care homes, and I became aware that within York, which is where I live, there was a particular shortage on some of the chaplains who assisted with on-call because they were over 70. I volunteered, and having worked recently in the NHS, I was able to be fast-tracked into providing some chaplaincy support. And I know within the hospital where people couldn't always be visited, holding crosses, for example, became really valued items in places where it was difficult to have very much, and very much that could be meaningful, but simply being able to pass that into intensive care or wherever else it may be. And then obviously with restrictions of cleanliness and sanitization, if that sadly ended in the death of the patient, that cross could be passed on to the family that had been with that person when very few other people could be. And I wouldn't underestimate the significance of those physical tokens. Oops, sorry, I need to go back one. So to summarize that, and I'm going to stop in a moment and hand over Charity. I don't think we can kind of ignore, even though we often want to say that the glass is half full, that there's been a lot of loss for all sorts of people in all kinds of ways. And I suspect that will take some unraveling if and when we move out of this into a safer position. Whether it's just anniversaries, birthdays, time spent with people, obviously, and quite a large number of people, many more than would normally be the case, died in 2020 and the early part of 2021. There have been people unable to attend funerals, memorials have not been held, and so on. And there is a need there that I think will need addressing. It's put many people into a situation of disconnection and uncertainty, a position of waiting. And I still go back to, although it is rather old now, Vanstone's book, Stature of Waiting. I think there's some profound wisdom in that, reflecting particularly on Jesus from the moment of his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane and being subject to other people's decisions and actions, but actually within that also salvation is wrought. It'll take time to unravel, decompress some of these experiences, and I wonder what in ministry we should begin to anticipate in those terms and as we can to offer to the wider community. There could be lasting implications. We may not share the peace physically in church for quite a while, perhaps a very, very long time. And PPE, I noticed Israel, which is the first country really to have, one of the first countries to have eased all its restrictions, all its COVID restrictions. One of the very few things remaining is that staff in care homes still need to wear masks. So that's going to potentially endure for quite a long time to come. And thinking then finally on this, the theological development and where incarnation and presence has been for chaplaincy and what that then means at a distance. Thank you. Shall I just hand straight over to Charity?
Yes, please do, and thank you. Thank you, Chris. And over to Charity. Thank you, Charity.
So Chris, thank you first of all for sharing that presentation. I'm as ever really grateful because you always come with some wisdom and experience to share with us. I just explain a little bit about who I am first of all. I'm a Methodist presbyter. I'm currently based in the northeast of England in the best appointment in British Methodism in a place called Middlesbrough. I'm also a PhD student, just coming to the end of that horrible stage of writing up my PhD, and I'm researching essentially women's embodiment, eating and the redemption of God. However, today I'm going to share something a little bit more personal perhaps, and rather than share a straightforward paper or give a kind of standard presentation, I'm going to share with you something of a narrative, of a story, and as I do that I hope to establish some theological principles as they relate to embodied ministry. I actually met Chris for the first time at the very end of 2015. It might have been early 2016. And he was at that stage lead chaplain at the Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust. So between 2015 and 2018, my identity as a young ordained minister, a theologian, a friend, was overwritten by significant critical illness. I've actually been a Methodist presbyter now for 11 years, and prior to that I spent 10 years working in the community for the church. I became critically ill in December 2015, partway through my second appointment in the Methodist Church, as I was working as part of a regional team delivering learning and development. And it's good to see Rachel McCallum with us, who I worked with. From December 2015 until February 2018, I was essentially in hospital with very few periods of respite. And Chris was part of a team of hospital chaplains who prayed for me, sat with me, held my hand, offered me communion, and enabled my re-embodiment. So the narrative I'm going to share with you is one of illness, of my illness, and what it meant as a minister to be disembodied and embodied in the midst of that experience. I want to raise the question of what embodied ministry could mean when we are disembodied people. And I'll begin by picking up on something that Chris has shared with us around disconnection and disembodiment. And this is going to run through the narrative that I'm sharing. I want to suggest that illness, just like a pandemic, is a space in which there's both a profound dislocation, disconnection, disruption, and ultimately disembodiment, whilst also being a space of remembering, re-embodying, and resurgam or resurrection. Through the sharing of this narrative, I hope I'll be able to enable some of you to think a little bit around the tensions of ministry in the dis of embodiment and the re of embodiment, the ways in which we might notice God in that dis and re-embodiment, and the significance of dis and re-embodiment in the God story for your context. Whilst in hospital, I spent a significant amount of time in critical care and high dependency units. The inability to lift my head off the pillow because of atrophy and the reliance on nursing staff to move my body in the bed may seem obviously a disembodying experience. However, such experiences only served to remind me of my embodied habitus. The environment of my body didn't change. It didn't become smaller or less. It just became a different kind of landscape, a terrain that was difficult to navigate. However, it was a landscape in which I was fully present. I say almost fully present, really, because it was also during my time on intensive care that, whilst being incredibly present and aware of my body, I also became very aware of the power of disembodiment. Hallucinations are a common feature for ICU patients. A combination of strong sedation and critical illness can lead to the mind compressing and reorganizing its thoughts in ways which can become vivid at best and frightening at worst. Whilst in a coma, you'll often hear medical staff say to friends or family to speak to the patient, talk to them, they might be able to hear you. But those words spoken and those noises heard through a haze of midazolam and fentanyl and other conscious suppressing drugs can become twisted and reframed by the unconscious mind, and combined together can lead to a fracturing of mind, body, and soul. The ICU and HDU hallucinations that I had related directly to my physical state, whilst also disenfranchising me from my body. So in one hallucination, I believed I was being dragged under the hospital by my ankles, that somebody was pulling me under the hospital by my ankles. The reality, of course, in my unconscious state was that I was attached to a device called floatrons, which prevent DVTs and which gently squeeze your ankles in and out. In another hallucination, I believed I was on a boat and I was sailing at sea. And this is a common hallucination relating to the movement of a bed and the proning of immobile patients. Such a disruption to the body story may also be mirrored in the pandemonium of pandemic living, where the expected norms of embodied experience are shaken and dislocated. In a brief moment of consciousness on ICU, in the midst of a confusing hallucination, I met my first hospital chaplain. A beautiful, compassionate and empathetic soul, a Japanese Anglican priest called Aikuko, who is also with us today. Aikuko prayed for me, stood beside my bed in what I think was a very short visit, but a very meaningful one. And despite my cognitive confusion at the time, I remember clearly that after she left my bedside, the nurse whose job it was to stand at the end of my bed for 12 hours, replacing IVs, tending wounds, monitoring OBS, making sure I stayed alive, said to me, "That chaplain's prayer was beautiful." And some of the other patients heard it too, and we were all very moved by it. In that brief prayer, Aikuko had re-embodied not just myself and other sick bodies around me, but also the compassionate bodies of the nursing staff. I can't remember the words that she used, but I can remember that it acted as a reminder of my holy inheritance, a reminder of myself to myself, of my God to my God centre. On another occasion, as I was moving forward in recovery, having been unable to take any oral nutrition for almost 12 months because of intestinal failure, Chris Swift appeared at my bedside with a student minister and communion. Aside from occasional mouthfuls of ice lollies, that bedside holy feast, offered to me by an experienced Anglican body and a nervous Anglican student body, was the first meal that I consumed. Their embodied hands placed the body of Christ into my embodied hands. That which had been disembodied became embodied. The body of Christ made real, the body of others enacted in that reality, and my own body resurging, resurrecting, re-nourishing in that shared feast. The ill body, just like the pandemic world, serves as a particular threat within any theological discourse in its signalling towards death. It reminds us of our mortality. And the Church's historically dualistic approach to the body and the soul leaves space for the potential risk that ill bodies may present to a theological discourse in which health, healing, and well-being are perceived as being aligned with a sanctified soul narrative. Health is seen as the body's overcoming or victory over death. The flip side of that perception, then, is that ill health, disability, and different bodies are aligned with failure, with sin, and with a rebellious non-conformity to the divine narrative. The truth, however, of all bodies, ill or well, is that, as Rachel Mann in her book Dazzling Darkness says, God has no fear of bodies. This is the truth at the heart of the incarnated God. The idea of God emptying him or herself into fragile flesh is one of the great shocks of Christian theology. So the liberative danger of the ill body is bound up in that body's ability to point us towards death in its degeneration and change over time. Our fear of death leads to a fear of illness as the mortifier, which in turn suggests that the features of illness that relate to disembodiment are best overcome or at least petitioned off from our embodied experience. The nature of ministry, however, is such that despite these strategies to ameliorate the ill body or the pandemic body's significance, despite, because of, and within the disembodied experience, it's impossible to truly disentangle ourselves from our bodies, as much as it's impossible to disentangle our body stories from the divine body story. Those body stories require attention, mediation, translation, re-embodiment. The minister's role as midwife of death, re-embodying the story through listening and translating, the body remains in a space of profound disembodiment as well as significant embodiment. The disconnection, dislocation, disruption, and disembodiment are as coherent in the God story as the remembering of the body, the resurgence of the body, the repopulating of the body, the re-embodiment. Ministry, therefore, offers the bridge between disembodiment and embodiment. Through Chris's, Ikuko's, Brian's, Connie's, and my critical presence at the side of or in the bed. The holding of the hand, the gentle words, the communion, the willingness to recognize the body as a body in its disembodiment, and the ability to enable a re-embodiment, all suggests the cohabitation of embodiment and disembodiment, of living and dying, of minister and ministered to, and above all, the cohabitation of a God fully enfleshed and a God equally disembodied.
Thank you so much, Charity, and Chris too. And I hesitate to go straight from there into a conversation. I feel we need a moment. But perhaps in a moment, can you prepare yourselves for that conversation? Because I believe you've talked ahead of how you're going to talk together. So I won't make any words, or anybody else. We'll just hand over to you for when you want to start.
Thank you. So thanks Charity as well for yeah. I must say I've never visited any patient with such an impressive collection of theological books beside a hospital bed. Yes. The first question we're going to start with, and I feel a bit bad about this because we did talk about it, but I've now readjusted that question, Charity, which I'm about to ask, but I think it's just re-expressing what we talked about a little bit earlier. I mean, it just feels to me, in listening to you there, there's such a heritage, it seems to me, in Western theology of almost of alienating the body, you know, that theology must be as abstract and as uncontaminated by the lived experience of what it means to be human. And maybe you quoted the work of Rachel Mann there, that does feel to me there's a bit of a turn of the tide within that, and a way of looking at things differently. And do you think, given that, and given your experience and the experience of the pandemic, there might be a further kind of shift or rebalancing in theology?
Yeah, so I think Sue mentioned this at the beginning. I'm a feminist theologian, and feminist theology has historically always explored the role of the body, because our theology comes through our experience, and we experience the world through our bodies. So there are a number of feminist theologians going back donkey's years who've written about the role and the nature of embodiment, but it's more recently with people like Lisa Isherwood, Hannah Bacon, Karen O'Donnell, people like that, who are writing about embodiment and experience, and cultural experience, and lived experience. In terms of the pandemic, and how we do theology in light of that, embodied theology in light of that. Where I minister at the moment is an area of particular deprivation, and the biggest issue during the pandemic here has been food poverty. And what does it mean to walk into a church building with your cheeks burning scarlet and your belly empty to ask for some free food? And what does that lived experience of a hungry body tell us about the nature of God? So there's a whole load of work, I think, to be done around embodiment and a kind of mid-pandemic and post-pandemic theology. I don't know, in terms of MHA and the kind of older lived-in body, whether there's some maybe joined up thinking to be done, maybe some joined up theological thinking to be done there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think there is a lot of avoidance, as it were, of contemplating the older body, and there may be all sorts of reasons for that, our own fears, society's fears. I mean, in one respect, and we were talking a bit earlier, it feels to me that the results of recent elections in England say something about the fact that, you know, very large numbers of older people dying within care homes actually is not hugely consequential. And I think that's tied to ageism, which is connected to the body and indeed the mind, and the changes that take place as we age, and the degree to which people can recede in terms of their presence in the political life of a community and indeed of a nation. And theologically, I think there's probably, although people like John Swinton, you know, are doing extremely valuable work teasing out and exploring some of the theology of what it means to live with dementia, and also physical changes, and all the theology that is coming out of disability studies and understanding people with different abilities within society and what that means. And whether the pandemic will, or whether we will simply slam the door on some of the learning that might come out of this. And I think that I have to say that is a possibility as well. It feels a little bit at the moment that we've seen in terms of the questioning from the Select Committee and Matt Hancock's about, you know, throwing a defensive ring around care homes and so on. And despite the very, very questionable legitimacy of that statement, I'm not sure it's really doing much harm to government at the moment.
Yeah, which kind of makes me wonder where we will return to, you know, theologically, societally, and whether, you know, the common phrase that I hear from people is when things get back to normal. And I still hear that phrase, and I still find myself saying, I'm not sure we're going to be back to how you remember things.
And is it even desirable?
Yeah.
Is that to say, you know, is there nothing we can learn from this that actually means we're not back to where we were? We've actually got to a better place. But I don't know. But in terms of what you were saying about your current location and ministry, I mean, it feels that many of the inequalities of society are just being stretched even further by the consequences of the pandemic. And of course, some people doing very nicely financially, economically out of it. And other people absolutely struggling. And today in the news, wasn't there, about the number of children with free school meals and what that's saying about those changes within communities?
Yeah, so I think it's Catherine Keller who wrote a fabulous article at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm going to completely misquote her, so forgive me, but she said something about the relationship between the word pandemic and pandemonium, and them having the same root, and how the pandemic had shone a spotlight on the pandemonium, meaning all the demons, had shone a spotlight on all the demons that were already present, but which we had somehow managed to cover up in the ways in which we operate and live our lives. So systemic poverty, injustice, vulnerability, all these kinds of things. And the pandemic had shone a spotlight on those things. I wonder then what it would mean for ministry. You know, what does it mean? This is a bit of a big question, but I'm going to ask it. What does it mean for embodied ministry in a post or mid-pandemic world?
I mean, speaking as an Anglican, I'll confess that at this point. I mean, it feels to me the church has been pretty quiet in some respects during the pandemic. And I just wonder whether a church that kind of published Faith in the City in the 80s or whenever it was, you know, might have had a lot more to say, because that report inevitably was concerned in part about the bodies and the physical embodied living of people within inner city context and deprivation. But that doesn't necessarily feel recently to have been the kind of priority and focus.
I think from my perspective, there are a number of things that will reshape embodied ministry at the end of, mid and post pandemic, and they are around a very strong awareness of physical presence. So I now go to church on a Sunday. I'm no longer able to hug people. I have elderly, very isolated church members who I know are just never feel human touch anyway, even without a pandemic, and that's hugely magnified. An awareness of the space we have to keep from one another, this dislocation of physical space. If I go and visit people, so I have a wedding in July, and I've already had a grumpy email off the mother of the bride saying, please can we not wear face masks, because in pubs they don't wear face masks, so we don't want the photos to have face masks in them. And it's this kind of barrier, you know, PPE becomes a barrier, a protective barrier perhaps, but it can be perceived as another kind of barrier. And it's navigating all these things in what I would consider a very embodied ministry. So yeah, we're still learning, aren't we? It's
Yes, I mean, deprivation, I think, has made some people reevaluate, again, those things we take for granted, isn't it? And I found it incredibly moving to be able to administer communion again.
Yeah.
You know, for a very long period, and placing that into somebody's hand, even though standing slightly as far away as I could in order to do that. Just one thing, I think, in relation to perhaps what the church, informed by the experience of its ministers, might do. And interesting, MHA was founded really from the pastoral experience of a minister who kept meeting people who were at home, isolated and anxious about their later years, and it prompted Walter Hall to found MHA, or to lead to its foundation. Is what do we do with that experience? And one of the things we were talking about, I mean, you can look at one way that, you know, our isolation of older people was, you know, absolutely, you know, in their interest to make sure that they didn't become unwell, etc. You could also say that older people had become dangerous, because if they became ill, they would overwhelm the NHS, and that would then begin to affect other age categories seeking medical assistance in different ways. And I think we do need to tease out some of the ethics and motivation and understanding of what has gone on. And I'm not sure always what has been purported has really been the reason for some of the choices we've made. And obviously there is a bit already emerging. I think there's a legal case about do not resuscitate orders being written without the proper process of consent.
Yeah, and this notion of danger links in, I think, with some of the things I was attempting to express around this dangerous notion of an ill body, in the same way dangerous notion of an older body, because of the reminders of mortality and the risks that they bring to our own selves and the selves of others. And it's interesting because Fiona has said in the comments about similar attitudes of vulnerability equaling expendability and mortality rates for disabled people during the pandemic. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you've gone on to say it wasn't just older people, many younger disabled people shielded for more than a year. Blanket DNR is also written for people with learning disabilities. And certainly those of us who have chronic illness, that experience was very similar. This sense that you almost become the untouchable, don't you? If you're elderly, if you're ill, if you're disabled, a pandemic makes you physically and in every other way untouchable.